Hi, everybody. Welcome to another one of our student ministry online lessons. This week, we're going to start a new series titled Worth It. In this series, we're going to look at Jesus' final days, his death, his resurrection, as well as some experiences of the early church. And we're going to do that to show why it's worth it to follow Jesus. And we're going to start that conversation today by talking a little bit about suffering. Because, when we experience something difficult, we want to be comforted, and sometimes the thing we need most to be comforted is someone who understands what we're going through. It can be hard to have a conversation and really feel that comfort when we're talking with someone who doesn't understand the situation or has never experienced the same things as us. And so I think that's an important point to make before we look at our Bible stories today. And we're gonna, talk about suffering because, when life gets tough, especially with a lot of the situations we're facing now, it's easy to feel alone. It's easy to feel like we're the only ones who are experiencing exactly what we're going through, and that no one else could possibly understand. And a lot of times people will tell us, God is with us, but it can still feel like we're going through life all alone, even if we believe that with our whole heart. Especially, in situations like when your friends turn your back or their backs on you, when you don't make the team, maybe when you don't pass a certain test, win whatever awards you wanted. Maybe when someone says something hurtful, or if things at home aren't good. Maybe your family is struggling with certain things. In all those times, life is difficult, and we might wonder. Just like we talked about last series with the story of Job, like why would God let this happen? And maybe we think, maybe I should just give up following Jesus. Maybe we think it's not worth it because we don't feel like God is there and we don't feel any comfort. And so this might come as a surprise, but we want to talk today about how Jesus understands what it's like to suffer and to have the same feelings that we do. So, if you've been around church for a while, you've probably heard that obviously the story of Jesus dying and rising from the dead a few days later. That's what we celebrate every Easter. That's what we're going to celebrate next Sunday. But before we talk about what happens after Jesus died and the resurrection, I wanted to talk today about what happened before that, because I think the stories that we read about Jesus before his death and resurrection. They can show us a lot about suffering. So in Matthew chapter 26, in this one chapter, Jesus experiences more suffering, more difficulties than I think any of us can imagine. He said goodbye to his friends, like he knew he was going to die. He was plotted against and betrayed by someone close to him. He was let down by most people that he loved, and he was arrested, taken to trial. He was sentenced to death. He was spit on. He was beaten and betrayed by even more friends. And so I want to go ahead and read just what happens a short time before that in Matthew chapter 26. So starting in verse 36, it says, Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, Sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Now, we might imagine Jesus walked toward death with peace and ease, emotionally speaking. But the account of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane tells a different story. And all the biblical accounts in the Gospels of this moment in the garden say that Jesus was overwhelmed and in anguish and exhausted because he knew what was about to happen. They even tell us that his sweat turned to blood, and this condition is so rare, but it happens under extreme stress and anguish. And so, in his final hours, we see Jesus asking God, "Is there any other way?" And we think about this, and that might be confusing to understand. We think, well, why wasn't Jesus listening to God? But that's not really the case. Jesus wasn't trying to disobey or go against God's plan. It wasn't like they weren't on the same page. He understood, Jesus did, that he was about to face God's wrath, that he was about to feel the separation from God that he had never experienced before, and that was him taking on our punishment for our sin. And so he understandably asked God if there was any other way for God's plan to be accomplished. So this wasn't Jesus trying to disobey or trying to get out of what was coming. He was willing to die for us, and submitting to the will of God. He was just kind of, understandably knowing what was coming. He wanted to see if there was a different way, and so that was, Jesus's fully human side, I think, coming through and understanding what he was about to face. And so, not only did Jesus suffer himself, but many people in the first century, many people who were following Jesus, suffered because of their faith in him. The Roman government that was in power at the time was threatened by the teachings of Jesus and the movement that Jesus began, the early church. They were threatened by that. And so that meant his followers, especially the disciples that we read about in the Bible, they endured all kinds of suffering and torture and oppression. And so naturally, this made Jesus' followers question, like, is this worth it? Is following Jesus worth all that we're going through? And so many of Jesus's early followers were Jewish. And so while they were raised to follow all of the laws and beliefs of Judaism that we read about in the Old Testament, many of these Jewish Jesus followers, in the face of persecution, they were considering going back to their old ways, even though they had decided to follow Jesus. And that's where the New Testament book of Hebrews comes in. Hebrews was actually a letter that was written to followers of Jesus who weren't sure if all their pain and suffering that they were going through was worth it. So I want to read a few verses from the book of Hebrews. Starting in chapter 2, verse 9, it says, "But we see him for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone." Then in verse 17 it says, "Therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted." And this theme is continued in chapter 4, starting in verse 14. It says, "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." Now, there's some big words in that passage, but there's also a lot of truth if we look at what this is really saying. So there's a few things we have to understand to really grasp the true meaning of this text. So the writer of Hebrews says that Jesus is our great high priest. And this is a Jewish concept that the readers in the first century would have understood really well. In Judaism, a high priest was someone who made sacrifices to God. They helped people connect more with God, and they prayed to God on the people's behalf. So that was the role of the high priest. But when the writer says that Jesus is our new high priest, Jesus didn't just make sacrifices, he became a sacrifice on our behalf. He gave up his own life to make a way for us to connect with God, right? He is the only way for us to get to the Father, as John says. And he also represents us before God. We have the ability to pray to God, and that's only through Jesus. And so to these, Jewish Jesus followers who understood the message and the importance of a high priest, this was a pretty convincing argument about why they should follow Jesus. These Jewish Jesus followers, they weren't struggling because they needed to be convinced that Jesus was God. They were struggling because life got hard. They didn't need a convincing argument for, why, God loved them or why Jesus actually died on the cross. Like, those are things that some people wonder nowadays. But they needed someone to comfort them in the midst of their suffering. And I think especially right now, that's something we all need as well. So the writer of Hebrews pointed them back to Jesus, who was their Savior who suffered. Now, the writer of Hebrews reminds us that Jesus understands what it's like to have a close friend turn their back on you, to feel like everyone hates you, to lose someone you love, to be tempted just as we are, and to be rejected. All these things Jesus faced just like us. He faced the emotions, the difficulty, all of these things. And so the book of Hebrews tells the early followers of Jesus and us to just hang on and to remember that Jesus knows what it's like to suffer. And so, in the middle of our difficulties, we can know that Jesus is with us in whatever difficulty we face. I think that gives us a new perspective and a new meaning for saying that God is with us. Because a lot of times, even when we say that, it feels like God is distant and maybe that God doesn't understand. But the writer of Hebrews, and looking at the story of Jesus in the Gospels, makes it pretty clear that Jesus does understand what we're going through. And so we've said that comfort means more when it comes from someone who understands what we're going through. And if that's true, then Jesus understands and can comfort us better than anyone, because he knows suffering and he knows difficulty better than anyone. And so when life gets hard, one of the reasons we can hold firmly to Jesus, he's experienced suffering. He knows exactly what we're going through. He understands the emotions that we're going through and the situations that we are facing. And he's with us every step of the way. And so when Jesus, stared death, torture, rejection, and humiliation in the face, he decided that you were worth it, right? He chose to willingly go through those things because we were worth it, each and every one of us. And so, if following Jesus ever gets too hard or too exhausting, and we're asking ourselves, is it worth it? I think the author of Hebrews is reminding us that Jesus is worth it too, because Jesus can bring us the comfort that we're needing in those moments. Life isn't easy. Jesus even says that following after him is difficult. That because we're following Jesus, we might face rejection, we might face humiliation. There are things that we might not understand. There might be days that we just want to give up in following Jesus. But in those moments, we need to remember that the Jesus who suffered, the Jesus who died on our behalf, is suffering with us. All right, because he went through those things. I think one of the reasons that he was willing to go through all of that is so he could comfort each and every one of us. So the one thing I want us to be thinking about is what if everything difficult that we face is an opportunity to know Jesus better? Like, what if we had that perspective? Instead of thinking, well, this is really hard and maybe following Jesus isn't worth it anymore. What if that situation is just an opportunity to know Jesus better? Because Jesus experienced those kinds of suffering. So that is my challenge for you this week, is to take anything difficult that you're facing right now, and I think a lot of us are facing similar difficulties, but take those things that you're facing and think through how it can be an opportunity for you to know Jesus better. Maybe you're lonely, maybe you're stressed, maybe you're afraid, maybe you're disappointed. I think Jesus knows what all those things are like. And so what if, instead of asking, God, why are these things happening to me? I don't know if I can face these any longer. What if you said, Jesus, when did you feel this way? And can you help me? Can you be with me in these moments? Because I don't think there's any greater comfort in those situations, in the midst of pain, than when we know that somebody else gets it, and especially when that person is Jesus, is our Creator, who knows us, loves us, and suffered for us. And so it is really incredible to know that the Jesus who suffered suffers with you. And so that's what I want to leave you guys with this week. hopefully that's helpful, especially with everything that's going on in the world right now. Just to remember that following Jesus is worth it, in that Jesus suffered and he understands our suffering. Well, one last thing before we go. Last week, I made a promise to you guys, an unfortunate one for myself, but I promised that if we had to do this video series again, that I would show you one embarrassing picture from my childhood. So that's going to pop up on the screen. I was very tempted not to do this, and I also struggle with technology, so that's the best I can do. That is me in 8th grade. Not a good time for obvious reasons, but yep. So hopefully that made you laugh, even at my expense. Jesus suffered the same things that we are suffering, and so he understands. And I think the thing that we need most in those moments is comfort, and Jesus can offer that. So hopefully that helps where you guys are at this week, and is a blessing to you as well.